Hey guys, it's Sandro here. Today's video is a direct comparison of three cutting compounds including Sonax Cutmax, Koch Chemie H901 and the last Cut Plus. A cutting compound is basically a heavy or coarse car polish that's ideally focused around removing car defects in a primary or first step of paint correction. So when tackling more severe car paint defects such as random isolated deeper scratches, heavy oxidation, water and bird poo etchings, or even refining sanding marks, these are the compounds we reach for. In saying that, a good cutting compound should be able to produce relatively decent gloss and clarity on certain paint types, provide the user with a relatively good application experience, have flexibility and provide great value. The cutting compounds in this review will be judged in three vital areas including their user experience, their defect removal performance, and their finishing ability to see how they compare in those areas. So let's get to it. The footage in this video is just a small portion of the testing that took place over several days working on a number of different panels in both in and outdoor environments, on hard, soft, clear-coated and single-stage paints using both rotary and DA polishes with wool, microfiber and foam pads. I also used a variety of techniques, sometimes being very precise and gentle and other times being quite sloppy and aggressive, which was all about trying to discover as much as I can about these compounds when pushed. We all work a little differently in diverse environments with various skill levels, equipment and goals, so I really tried to explore as much of that as I could before drawing my conclusions. The first and important area of assessment was the user experience, looking at how these compounds are like to work with in several aspects. No matter how well a compound cuts or finishes, if it's a real pain and hassle to use, you're simply just not going to want to use it. Starting with an area that's more prominent with rotary use is product sling. Now you'll see later on in a few tests that if you're a bit loose with your technique, each and every one of these compounds will in fact sling and splatter like crazy. But even when good technique was employed, I did experience varying levels of splatter with each individual compound. Sonax Cutmax was bang in the middle here. I didn't see it as a real issue, but I also wouldn't say it's great in this area. With Koch Chemie, sling was definitely a greater issue and it was a little harder to eliminate it, but again I wouldn't say it was terrible. The last Cut Plus did resist sling and splatter better than the other two, though as I mentioned it can certainly sling when pushed. Next up was looking at potential dusting. When used out of direct sunlight and without pushing these compounds, I did experience mild to no dusting in most cases. However, when used in sunlight and when pushed, it did become very clear which of these compounds is more prone to dusting than others. The best compound in this area was without a doubt Sonax Cutmax. It just resisted dusting in every polishing cycle I performed better than the other two compounds. In direct sunlight I certainly saw it dust a little, but even then it was clearly less than the others, and as a whole it would have to be one of the best cutting compounds as far as low dusting goes. On the opposite side of the spectrum, H901 was the worst in this area. In direct sunlight, the dusting was quite high, but even out of direct sunlight, if you work it a touch long, the dusting continuously increases and can become an issue. The last Cut Plus was in the middle here, definitely better than H901, but not quite as good as Cutmax in this area. Overall guys, I felt that H901 was a moderate dusting compound, while the last Cut Plus was a low dusting compound and Sonax was an ultra low dusting compound if I had to put them into a category. The next area of assessment was the wipe off. I have to firstly say that I think the wipe as a whole is very good and easy with all of them. I just never found it to be terrible. But when pushed and perhaps using a little too much product and working it too long, it did become apparent that some were more forgiving than others in this area. Cutmax was again the leader here. I think when I used a really nice technique, H901 was potentially a little nicer to wipe, but at the extremes in sunlight and with microfiber pads and increased heat, Sonax just stayed more consistent and was always good in this area, while Koch Chemie was a lot more up and down. As a whole, I think the last Cut Plus has a pretty good, consistent and nice wipe off even when pushed, but at least here in this comparison I'd say it was third place overall just because the other two were so good. Next up was pad residue buildup and control. One thing I can say quite confidently is that Sonax Cutmax does overload the pads far quicker than the other two compounds, and it's additionally harder to remove the residue from the pads. I don't think it's really possible to brush the residue out of the pads, and I think it's mostly because Cutmax just stays so wet and strongly bonded to the pads, so compressed air is almost vital to control its residue. But all in all, there's no getting around that you'll need more pads, or at least you'll need to wash your pads more frequently with Cutmax. Koch Chemie H9 was only slightly better at prolonging residue buildup compared to Cutmax, but the real difference was that it brushed and blew out of the pads far easier than all the compounds here, so it was better in that respect. The Last Cut Plus was a compound here that resisted pad clogging the most, and although it wasn't quite as easy to brush or blow it out of the pads compared to H901, it was still quite good in this area. I think a really important area of a compound's user experience that's sometimes overlooked is cycling performance. So how does it visually communicate? How well lubricated is it? And how well does it hold together or break down in a polishing cycle? Now all these compounds have user technique instructions, suggestions and claims from their brands, all of which I did try and so much more, but this is what I personally discovered. A lot of compounds claim to have long or endless polishing cycles, but Cutmax is one of the few that actually lives up to it. It's actually crazy how long you can polish with this compound. I went for over 5 minutes at times and I felt I could have gone even much longer, which is pretty crazy. I also feel its lubrication is fantastic. It really aids in allowing the pads to spin more freely, especially reducing stall with DA polishers. Now one thing I personally don't like about Cutmax is that there's virtually zero visual or physical feedback. It just doesn't communicate with the user, change or show a progression during a cycle, so it's not a compound you can read. But look guys, that's probably a more personal thing rather than a pro or con. Koch Chemie H901 is almost the complete opposite to Cutmax. It's an extremely well visually communicating compound. It starts thick and opaque and then begins to thin out, become translucent and start to dry and potentially dust if you go too long. So you always know where you're at and when to stop. However, contrary to the brand's claims, I don't feel this is a compound you can use for prolonged periods, and certainly not in my environment or during my testing. So I'd strongly disagree with that claim as it breaks down and dusts like crazy if you do. Now, this doesn't mean it's bad, it just means that I personally felt it had a shorter polishing cycle. Now one big flaw I just can't overlook with H901 is its lack of adequate lubrication. You may pick up on this more during the rest of the video, but I generally struggled with pad rotation on my DA polishers each and every time. I had great rotation and no problems using speed 4 with my DA polisher with Cutmax and Last Cut Plus, but all I got was stall with H901 and I had to go above speed 5 every time just to maintain pad rotation. And with rotary use, I experienced increased pad hopping and just found it harder to work smoothly and control the polisher with H9 compared to the other two compounds. As far as its cycling characteristics go, the Last Cut Plus is somewhat of a middle ground here between Cutmax and H901. You get some pretty good visual communication of when it's at its prime cutting stage and when it's moved on to finishing, and although its prolonged polishing cycle isn't quite as infinite as Cutmax, it's still certainly far longer than H901. And I'd also say that it continues to cut extremely well, far longer than the original Last Cut formula by comparison. All in all guys, each of these compounds do have their stronger and weaker points when working with them, but as a whole I think these are a little nicer to use than most cutting compounds on the market. In saying that, I did feel that Sonax Cutmax was perhaps the overall winner here with all things considered. The Last Cut Plus with second place, and Koch Chemie H901 was a close third place as far as the user experience goes. Next up was assessing perhaps the core feature of these cutting compounds, which is their ability to effectively remove paint defects in an efficient manner. Once again guys, this was all based around a multitude of testing because different compounds can produce more or less cut depending on the specific technique used. So in some tests I went hard and fast straight off the bat, and in others I slowed things down, eased off, and even used a combination of techniques, looking for result changes when using certain machines' pads, and this is what I discovered. Based on all my testing, I think it's fair to say that all three compounds here do in fact produce at least good levels of cut and can certainly be used in most initial cutting stages with success. But after some basic testing and results, the question then became, how do I extract the most cut out of each individual compound, and when I do, which ones do in fact cut more? I'll start by discussing cutting techniques and then overall cutting performance abilities. I don't feel Sonax Cutmax is a hugely machine, pad or technique dependent compound. What I mean by this is that you can throw a lot of variations in what you use and how you use it, and the cut and experience you get tends to stay a lot more consistent than the others regardless. Now in saying that, I felt that when maximum cut is desired and it's a harder paint type, a rotary and wool pad with increased aggression is the way to go, because this compound can take it and even thrive with it more so than the others. So a delicate touch or finessed approach isn't really where this compound thrives. It's better suited, at least in my testing, to a slightly heavier hand that seems to pay off in increased cutting performance more so than its competition. Now every compound breaks down regardless of whether its abrasives are designed to resist breaking down, so there's always limitations and you still get more cut with Sonax doing 2 quicker passes rather than 1 long one. So don't go overboard and think it's okay to polish indefinitely, or that it just keeps on cutting for the same level forever, because it doesn't. But in a direct comparison to the other compounds, you can go longer and you can go harder and see a benefit in doing so within reason. I think you could take everything I just said about Sonax Cutmax and do the complete opposite with Koch Chemie H9 if cutting performance is your goal. I personally found that this isn't a compound you want to abuse or approach too heavy-handedly. The best cut I achieved was obtained by starting a little slower with less pressure, and then once I could see it breaking down, I continued with a bit more machine speed and pressure to extract more cut from the final couple of passes. Unlike Cutmax, I also discovered that using a little more compound on the pad had a greater benefit as far as cut goes, though it did decrease the overall user experience, so a balance is needed. Right off the bat, H901 does actually cut more than Sonax, but the difference is that once its peak cutting ability starts to wane, it does drop quite rapidly cut-wise, so it's best not to break down those abrasives too quickly. You'll also find that with H901, it can be a far better choice doing a couple of quicker passes compared to a longer one more so than the other 2 compounds, as this isn't a compound that responds well to prolonged cycles. Get in and get out quick, and it certainly performs quite well. The last Cut Plus is yet again a middle ground here as far as cutting technique goes, but I'd still say it's quite different to both, and here's why. It's an extremely adaptable compound, so you don't need to go hard to extract its cut, and you don't need to ease off either. The cut's just always there, and I'm really not 100% sure whether or not there's even a benefit to using it with a particular technique or method versus another. Just polish the way you like to, and it seems to perform. I also felt that it was just so at home with more demanding microfiber pads, creating just as much cut if not more compared to wool pads and rotary use, and that's just not something I saw with the other 2 compounds. It starts off with just as much cut as H9, potentially even more, and although it does diminish its cut a little quicker than Cutmax, it's not that far off, and you can choose to do quicker sets or longer sets and just see what works out best on that particular paint. I think ideally you're not using it as aggressively as Cutmax, but a little more so than H9. But again guys, you can really just go your own way. The way you personally like or choose to work can certainly influence the cut you achieve with these compounds. But with taking that all into account, I also felt there's more broad defect removal capabilities with all these compounds here. The last Cut Plus just consistently cuts more in almost every test I performed, and as a whole I'd say it was at least a step or 2 above Sonax in this area. Similarly, Cutmax just seems to cut at least a step or 2 better than H9 in nearly every test I did, and seems to get there with greater ease and efficiency. It's not always easy assessing the cut in a compound because of all the variables, but I do feel quite confident in these findings due to the repeated and consistent results. The final area of assessment was looking at the finishing quality these 3 compounds are able to produce. There's a lot of compounds that can cut extremely well, but I and many other detailers don't use them because the finish is so bad with increased compounding swirls and marring that's just so difficult and hard to refine in a follow-up polishing step. And it also eliminates the possibility of doing a more efficient single-stage correction on certain paint types. So the ability of a cutting compound to finish at least reasonably well is extremely important in my world, as it just makes paint correction so much easier and quicker. Like almost every compound or polish on the market, the key to tuning a compound and finishing well is using limited product, reduced heat, and good pad selections. Although we're going to have a look at a soft black paint in this test, just because it's easier and more obvious to evaluate on camera, I assessed the cut and finish on every panel I worked on with every pad and machine I used, which, trust me, was a lot. But in the end, this is what I found. Although there may be certain circumstances where Sonax Cutmax can finish reasonably well, such as hard pearl white or hard silver metallics that are great at masking swirls and haze and more scratch resistant, Cutmax just isn't going to be a single stage compound that leaves a reasonable or acceptable finish in at least 95% of cases. Even if we go back to the previous hard red paints, I actually found it hard to identify what was the original remaining defects and what was the compounding swirls created by Cutmax. But on this black panel, you'll see that even after I used a more appropriate polishing pad with reduced compound and better technique, it was pretty crazy just how much compounding marring Cutmax leaves behind. I just think if you use it, you just have to accept it for what it is. A first cutting step compound that'll always need a follow-up polishing step, and this was true for all soft, medium, and even harder paints I tested it on. With Koch Chemie H9, it was a very different story. This compound can actually finish quite well on certain hard to medium paint types. In fact, on some of the harder paints I tried it on, it was really quite a perfect finish with the right pad and technique choice, so it can definitely be a single stage compound in some cases. But apart from that, even when 2 steps were needed, it's just so much quicker and easier to refine compared to Cutmax that takes more work and aggression to do so. Now on softer medium paints, it's still never really going to achieve that amazing finish, but that can be said for almost every cutting compound on the market. Overall, I found it a bit more difficult to separate H9 and the Last Cut Plus in this finishing assessment. A lot of the results I achieved were quite similar between them, sometimes H9 doing a touch better and sometimes the Last Cut Plus. If I had to separate them here, I'd say that H9 tends to produce less fine haze, but a few more inconsistent compounding swirl marks in the finish. While the Last Cut Plus had a slightly more obvious uniform film of light haze, but less compounding swirls and marring. I think for a compound that cuts this well, the Last Cut's finish is more than reasonable and pretty impressive on hard to medium paints with all things considered. At least for me, it was clear here in the finishing ability that Cutmax isn't in the same league as the other 2 compounds. In fact, I don't think it's all that close or even debatable. Between H9 and the Last Cut Plus, it certainly is debatable and not as clear, but I think they are both really good here and both open up more doors to increase productivity and make refining paint so much more efficient. So let's wrap up this video. I try to present my findings in the most thorough, fair, and objective way I can, but these final conclusions will be my more subjective opinions. Starting with Sonax Cutmax, I 100% understand why this compound has become such a favourite amongst so many. From its nice and easy wipe off to its fantastic ability to resist dusting, an almost endless polishing cycle and decent amount of cut, it just ticks so many boxes, and even if you abuse this compound a little or work outdoors, it's still very forgiving. I also think you have to give Sonax credit for creating such a great user experience almost 7 or 8 years ago when it first came out, and when most other compounds back then were dusting and not so nice to wipe. I think they really understood what we wanted in a better user experience and delivered. It's also amazing just how unchanged it stays during a polishing cycle. I mean, love it or hate it, it is what it is and stays very consistent and predictable from the moment you turn the polisher on to the moment you lift it on the paint in its cut, finish and user experience, which is very uncommon. With all that's happened since its release, it's still a great compound, but I think it's fair to say that its cut isn't exactly up there with the best offerings today, and its finish is actually amongst the worst, to put it nicely. I still have a bottle of Koch Chemie H802 back from when the brand was really unknown here in Australia and not selling locally. I can't say I tested it out quite as thoroughly as H9, but I gave it a good go and thought it was quite a decent compound. I also think H901 is quite a good compound and feels like it cuts a touch better and finishes much better than H8. So it's great to see an improvement and evolution in the right direction. I like the way H901 visually communicates so clearly. It has quite a nice wipe off and it cuts very fast and finishes very quickly, making it a very speedy compound to use. I think it is a little prone to dusting but still acceptable there, and I also think it's not the heaviest cutting compound around but finds a better balance of cut and finish, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I really appreciate its great finishing ability. If there's one Achilles heel to this compound, it's the lack of adequate lubrication. I think it just inhibits pad rotation and promotes pad hopping, and I think it does a lot more than just that. Lubrication affects everything when it comes to a compound, and I honestly think that if it had better lubrication, we'd see increased cut, a better finish, less dusting, and longer potential work times. It just feels to me that there's something holding this back from being even better than it is, and if this was addressed, it could truly be an outstanding compound. I saw that Koch Chemie has released H902, which I couldn't seem to find at the time of making this review, but I hope that new formula addresses lubrication and takes this compound to the next level. When the original Last Cut first came out about 5 years ago, I was amongst those who immediately fell in love with it. Amazing cut, great finish, low dusting, easy wipe off, loads of flexibility in how you wish to work, with also being a compound that tamed more demanding microfiber pads. There's not a lot of cutting compounds that have such an impact on the global detailing world. Sonax Cutmax could be included here, as well as Meguiar's M105, Manzurna FG400, Scholl S3 Gold, 3M Perfected, and a couple of others, but it's still a small podium compared to the thousands of compounds out there. The Last Cut Plus took everything we loved about the original and added more cut without really affecting anything else. In fact, I almost feel it finishes a little better than the original, which isn't the easiest thing to do. It's also worth mentioning that this isn't a large or global brand with infinite resources. It's a single, independent detailer out in the States who set out to make a better compound, and I think it's fair to say he succeeded. But leaving all that aside, it's really the compound that matters and how it performs. I still think Cutmax has the best user experience, but it's not like the Last Cut Plus is horrible to use. It's actually very nice. The Last Cut also cuts the most, which is important in a cutting compound comparison, and it has at least as good a finish as H901, so that's a lot of ticks in boxes. As far as costs go, there's really not much in it from one compound to the other, at least not here in Australia. They are all a little on the pricey side. There's always specifics that come to play when assessing any area of a compound: environment, techniques, machines, pads, and obviously paint and defects. That's why I think it's important to explore and discuss all these things, and why in many cases certain compounds may just be a little more suited to certain people due to all these factors. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If there was one undisputed greatest compound of all time, there'd only be one compound in the world. I don't care what you guys use whatever makes you happy. I just want to put out good information that's helpful, and you can go off and make your own decisions. I think I'll leave it there, guys, and if you enjoyed this video and would like to say thanks and help support future content, you can do so by buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/ccad, in which I'll have a link to in the description box, or you can now hit the thanks button below the video. And thank you everyone for the support so far. As always, I really hope you guys enjoyed and found this video useful. Please share it with others, give it a like and comment below to show your support for this content, and I'll see you guys soon.